she'll always be with me. So hold on my heart, just hold on to that feeling. We both know we've been here before. We both know what can happen. So hold on my heart, just hold on my heart. So hold on my heart. Hey, just hold on my heart. I'm gonna tell you how it's gonna be. You're gonna give your love to me. I'm gonna love you night and day. We'll love is love and not fade away. We'll love is love and not fade away. My love's bigger than a Cadillac. I try to show it and I drive a man back. Your love for me just got to be real. For you to know just how I feel. When love is real, not fade away. When love is real, not fade away. I'm gonna tell you how it's gonna be. You're gonna give your love to me. Love to last more than one day. When love is love, not fade away. When love is love, not fade away. When love is love, not fade away. 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 When love is love, not fade away. When love is love, not fade away. When love is love, not fade away. 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 Not fade away.
Quando tá escuro e ninguém te ouve, quando chega a noite e você pode chorar, há uma luz no túnel do desespero. desesperados. Há um cais no porto pra quem precisa chegar. Eu tô na lanterna dos afogados. Eu tô te esperando, vê se não vai demorar.
Uma noite longa, pra uma vida curta, mas já não me importa. Basta poder te ajudar. E são tantas marcas que isso faz impacto do que sou agora, mas sem nascer me virar.
Eu tô na lanterna dos afogados. Eu tô te esperando, vê se não vai demorar. Uma noite longa, para uma vida curta, mas já não me importa. Basta poder te ajudar. Eu tô na lanterna dos afogados. Eu tô te esperando, vê se não vai demorar.
Baby, this is what you came for. Lightning strikes every time she moves, and everybody's watching her, but she's looking at you. What you came for. Lightning strikes every time she moves, and everybody's watching her, but she's looking at you. Till they can replay. Who knows why it's gonna be this way? We say nothing more than we need. I say your place when we leave. This is what you came for. Lightning strikes every time she moves, and everybody's watching her, but she's looking at you. I wanna jam it with you. We're jamming, and I hope you like jamming too. Ain't no rules, ain't no law, we can do it anyhow. Cause I will see you through. Cause every day we pay the price with a little sacrifice. Jamming till the jam is through. We're jamming. To think that drumming was the thing of the best. We're jamming, and I hope this jam is gonna last. No bull can stop us now, we neither beg, no we won't bow. Neither can be but no sword. We all defend the right, judge our children must unite. Your life is worth much more than gold. We're jamming, we're jamming in the name of the Lord. We're jamming, we're jamming right as right from your holy Mount Zion, holy Mount Zion. Just seated in Mount Zion, arrows of creation. Jamming, what you want. I wanna jam it with you. We're jamming. I hope you're jamming too. It jumps above my pride, truth I cannot hide, to keep you satisfied. True love that now exists is the love I can't resist. Jump by my side, drumming and drumming and drumming, drumming and drumming and drumming. Hope you like drumming too. Drumming, drumming, drumming. I wanna drum with you. Jump down the shelters to get away. The boys are cocking up their guns. Tell us, General, is it party time? If it is, can we all come? Don't think that we don't know. Don't think that we're not trying. Don't think we move too slow. It's no use after crying, saying it's a mistake. It's a mistake. After the laughter has died away, and all the boys have had their fun. No surface noise now, not much to say. You've got the bad guys on the run. Don't try to say you're sorry. Don't say he drew his gun. They've gone and grabbed old money. He's not the only one saying it's a mistake. It's a mistake. Tell us, Commander, what do you think? 'Cause we know that you love all that power. Is it on them? Are we on the brink? We wish it all, throw in the towel. We'll not fade out too soon. Not in this finest hour. We saw your favorite tune. We'll send a card and flower, saying it's a mistake. It's a mistake. It's a mistake. It's a mistake. No limit in the sky if I don't want to fly for you. No, I'm a tears in my eyes that I want to cry for you. With every breath that I take, I want you to share that air with me. There's no promise that I will keep. I climb a mountain that's not too steep. When it comes Keeping it alive, arrow got your name on it. Don't miss hold on alone and regret yourself on it. Open up your mind, clear your head. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you to discuss important issues such as sustainability and decolonialization. We have here three panelists, which is Professor David Zoga and Professor Sergio Vanderlei, and I. Nice to meet you. I'm Jussara. So now I'm gonna present a little bit the panelists. Let's start with David. Professor Zoga is an associate professor of management at the Grove School of Business, McMaster University, Ontario, Canada. Zoga is a founding executive of the Africa Academy of Management and an affiliate of the Academy of Management. His work is published on brand management, strategic human resource, and he also has authored 2 books on strategic fellowship titled How Employees Contribute to Organizational Productivity. And we also have Professor Sergio Vanderlei, which is professor from PPGA at Unigran Rio. He has a doctor and also a master degree in business administration at EBAP, Fundação Getúlio Vargas. And his main publications are in the Academy of Management Learning and Education, Organization, Management Learning, national journals such as CEPAL, RAI, Revista de Administração de Empresas, Cadernos EBAP e RAP, Revista de Administração Pública. And me, I'm Jussara, and I'm currently working at Fundação Getúlio Vargas as lecturer, and I'm a yearly career. So I finished my PhD a year ago about corporate social irresponsibility. And again, it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. So we're gonna start now with Professor Zoga. And Professor Zoga, it's all to you if you wanna share your screen. And thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Palestrante Husera Pereira. I appreciate the introduction. And I would also like to thank Alkeda Percy for this invitation to be here. Until this invitation, I didn't know of the common lineage I have with Brazil, so to speak. And it's when I was preparing this that I realized that there is a common lineage. And so because of that, I was very delighted to participate in this. The second reason for my excitement is that these 2 topics, sustainability and decolonization, are part of the streams of research that I do. I started sustainability research at the micro level, looking at sustainability within corporations, and that is where I propose green signature theory, essentially about the pattern of decisions and behaviors of HR managers with regard to corporate environmental sustainability. But since then, I have kind of moved it into the macro domain and looking at sustainability, particularly in Africa, in a different way. The decolonization part is also something that I have been very much interested in, particularly from an epistemological perspective, where we can influence knowledge outcomes by getting Africans to kind of move away from the Western or Eurocentric idea of knowledge as the only form or the best form. And that is why in the recent publication in Academy of Management, Learning and Education, I kind of trace the history of management education and knowledge across the various centuries, from the pre-colonial era all the way to the post-colonial era. So from that angle, these two topics are really at the heart of what I am interested in, because somehow they affect the ontology of Africa. And it's kind of good that, I would say, because as the current president of AFAM, I have to be interested in what would uplift Africa and its people. And at the center of everything else are these two things, because until we engage in decolonization in an effective way, the colonization is still going to continue as we observe it going on a daily basis. So this is a brief outline, and the first part is actually what I talked about, to express my profound gratitude to AMPAD and particularly to Al-Qaeda for inviting me to participate in this conference. And so what I'm going to do next is to highlight a little bit about the historical path that links Africa to Brazil. And then I will talk about what I would call our common fate and our common destiny. As I was preparing for this, those are the things that I found out and how they somehow impact Brazil and Africa in almost the same way. Okay. Let me begin with the historical path. At least, or before I forgot, I wanted to mention that ANPAD and AFAM, this linkage or partnership has come through IFSAM, the International Federation of Scholarly Associations of Management, of which both ANPAD and AFAM are represented. In that front, we also, at least I would like to thank IFSAM for linking the two organizations together, because this is the first of subsequent partnerships that we would engage in. This is the brief historical path that I'm going to talk a little bit about. And this is so common in so many ways, but as what we know, is that through the slave trade, a lot of Africans were sent to the New World, and that New World was both the North and the South. And as you can see from this diagram, most of them went to Brazil. As a result of that, you have certain cultural practices of Africa that are also found in Brazil. One of them is essentially, or briefly as I would point out, is through the common linkage or linkage in terms of how the Europeans viewed Africans in their attempt to save them. In one sense, at that time, is to make them more sustainable. And so you have concepts or terms that are similar in both places. But this diagram or this figure basically tells you that a huge chunk of Africa is found in Brazil. And as a result, decolonization and even sustainability is important to both Africa as well as to Brazil. I can see the Gold Coast here, and given that I come from Ghana, which used to be the Gold Coast, and based on the history I know from my place, that slave raiders came to my village and gathered some of our people, and they marched through Salaga all the way to Kintampo and to Cape Coast Castle, and then made their way to Brazil. It is very likely that some of my relatives are probably found their way to Brazil. The other linkage that I found on the part of Ghana and Brazil is that after the slave trade was abolished, and some of the Africans who were sent to Brazil were attempted to return, most of them found themselves in Ghana. As a result, you have a house in Accra, which the locals call the Brazilian house, simply because the returnees were all in that area, and particularly in that house that was built for them, and it had been there for a long time. So somehow Brazil and Africa have this connection. And that, to me, is very meaningful, very significant. I've never been to Brazil, but the next time I get a chance to go to Brazil, I'm going to jump on the plane or the ship, or however I'm going to go, I will jump on it because of this interest. The common destiny that I was talking about is this idea of Christianity. When it was brought to Africa, essentially the view was that Africa are damned, they are heathens, they are this, that, and they needed salvation. And as a result, they had to be converted. And the word for damnation in Igbo, or Yoruba rather, in Yoruba is Esu. And that same word is expressed in Brazil as Ezu, because the Africans who took it there, and with language changes, it went from Esu to Ezu. So that is, again, pointing to the common destiny or common faith. And that idea is also in colonialism, because I know in the research that I do, concepts and ideas about decolonization. Some of the first people to write about it were from Brazil, the Caribbean, and other places. But both decolonization and sustainability are about what I would call restoration. Restoration of the dignity of the people, in this case, Africans and Brazilians. And if you take it that Africans went to Brazil, then you would say Africans in both Africa as well as in Brazil. So I'm going to go a little bit in depth into this idea of decolonization and sustainability, particularly with a combination of research as well as observation and practice. One overriding philosophy that links both decolonization and sustainability is the Mat philosophy. Mat is this ancient Egyptian philosophy that was about the order of things in life. And it focused on making not only people, but also nature flourish. And the concept in Mat is this word serush, which in terms of worthiness of people and worthiness of nature, serush enjoined the ancient Egyptians at the time to always seek to flourish or make flourish people and nature. And if something happens that takes them down, they were enjoined to strive to make sure that their value and dignity was restored. And that is at the heart of decolonization and sustainability. Because while colonization, before I get into this, while colonization reduced the value of Africans and environmental degradation reduced the value of nature, decolonization and sustainability strive to make both flourish. As I was talking about, Karenga 2004 defined Mat as an interrelated order of rightness, getting things right. And it requires having right relations, right behaviors towards divine nature and humans. But in this case, I'm focusing on nature and humans. And what that means is that the rightness, the idea of rightness includes ontological and ethical sense of truth, justice, righteousness, and order. That means we have to be concerned about the well-being of humans and the well-being of nature. And it's right every time and always to make sure both are upheld, their well-beings are upheld. Obenga is this Francophone philosopher who actually studied Mat also and proposed that the idea of Mat manifested in 4 domains. The universal domain, which deals with any part of the world and how things are in place. But there's also the political domain regarding how leaders rule their subordinates. And then there is the social domain that specifies how individuals should relate with one another in the context of building a community that is good for all. It doesn't stop at the community or communal level, but it even goes further to the individual, the personal domain, and calls upon each individual to live in harmony with others, with nature, and with the divine, as Karenga talked about. So given that philosophy, in talking about decolonization, it's important for me to talk first about colonization, not in depth. But when we are talking about decolonization or colonization per se, invariably we come across these four elements. There is the colonization part that somehow can metamorphose in a new form of what some people call neocolonization, which our first president, Kwame Nkrumah, talked about, that the idea of colonization, which was ended with independence, manifested itself in a different way as neocolonialism. And in fact, some are even making the argument that the way things are going and the former colonial masters are behaving, they are engaging in recolonization. And one example I can think of recently is the president of France, Macron, trying to ensure that within Africa, you have most African countries speaking French. And as we know about culture, language is a major instrument of capture, a major instrument of colonization. So for him to parade throughout African countries, advocating and incentivizing the teaching of French, and given the history of France in Africa, it suggests that France is getting into this idea of recolonization. And that is why the idea of decolonization matters a lot. And it matters because, and I was just going to show some data when I searched for the word decolonization in Africa. That's what I mean by the data here. I found 327 from Google Scholar sources. Not all of them were articles, but some were just opinion, practitioner views, and so on. But the idea of decolonization as we have it in Africa, which is critical, is that it involves all these things. First, education, what is taught. As I pointed out in my recent piece in Academy of Management, Learning and Education, Africans had educational practices even before there was Europe. Because in ancient Kemet, there were educational practices that made ancient Kemet triumph. You had them in the Old Kingdom, you had them in the New Kingdom, you had them in the Middle Kingdom. In fact, it is because of that good education, I would say, that you had the Greeks coming to Kemet to learn. And there is a widely acknowledged view that Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and a lot of the Greek philosophers, their ideas that are accepted now originated from Africa because that is where they studied. But as some have argued, because of the Black Athena what essentially was African was altered so as to deny them the honor of having excellent education. With regard to language, as I mentioned, France, what it is doing now is going against decolonization, but prominent scholars in Africa, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for example, Ayikwe Ama, for example, even Soyinka, for example, have advocated that education be taught in the African languages. But it's not easy to do that for a host of reasons. In the area of politics, the way Africans govern themselves, and I remember having a debate about a colleague when we had a webinar, that the idea of governance in Africa as we see it today, what is being talked about as proper governance, existed in Africa long before in ancient Kemet. And it was all guided by math as to how a leader should behave, how a people should relate with one another, and all the elements that are within politics. So to decolonize, we need to change that. The question is, can that be done? The fourth point there is economies. To decolonize, and sometimes some argue for the Chinese approach, not necessarily having one leader or one dictator, but essentially having a system, an economy that prioritizes the needs of Africans in such a way that they relate with others equally. I was just watching a show by an economist on who was arguing for Africa and how they should try to have things on their own and do things on their own. And his argument was, in fact, somebody asked the question, why is it that Africans have debt that they cannot get out of it, but the US has more debt and yet is able to get out of it? And Michael's explanation was that the difference is that with the US debt is in US dollars. So if US is having problems, they can just print more dollars. But for Africans, they don't have their debt in their own currency. They have it in the currency of the US. And because of that, when they have debt, they have to find a way of converting that debt to the US dollar that would enable them pay their debt, which means they have to find the economic principles or mechanisms that enable wealth generation for them to get money to be able to pay the debt. And basically what Michael was saying is that the system that was set up by the UN, the World Bank, IMF, they were all set up in such a way that the original advocates would benefit. So if we are talking about decolonization, then we have to think about how the economies can be decolonized. And then the last thing is cultures. We have to think of how African cultures can be, I wouldn't say separated from, because that is never possible. We're in a global world, but somehow would have some autonomy and some dignity associated with it. Because at the heart of it are some challenges. And the challenges, I summarize all of them into what I call the spheres of influence. At the macro level, the spheres of influence are the international bodies, the developed countries that constantly interfere or deny Africans real or authentic autonomy in running themselves. And because of that, it becomes a challenge. In fact, when you think about from what we are interested in, which is management and organization, when you go into Africa, and I've always asked this question, how many organizations in Africa have what I would call native or autonomous or autochthonous practices that are purely African? Invariably, I have never had an answer that says this organization is an exemplar. All of them are either using legacies of colonialism, the structures, the mechanisms, and everything. All of those things, and they are not working. So the challenges for me and for African scholars, AFAM, I mean, if we could, the first is to start looking at how education can be different. You have AACSB going into Africa and essentially structuring, or I wouldn't call it dictating, but essentially suggesting how business schools should be run. In fact, some of the scholars or the deans observed that and they wanted to come up with their own, like AACSB model. But that is just one challenge. And across all of these sectors, you have similar spheres of influence taking place. And so it's not, decolonization is great, but it's going against several headwinds. So let me come to sustainability, another major area of interest, I would say. And recently I had a book chapter on this idea of sustainability, which this was the model that I presented. I was basically arguing that sustainability, the book chapter was on sustainability and value chains and their linkage, they go together. So that's what this model was attempting to show. Basically, according to math philosophy, there's an environmental philosophy. And that philosophy has institutionalization mechanisms, regulation, renewable use, and waste destruction, and so on. And as I pointed out earlier on, it is to make to make nature worthy. Okay. And to be able to do that, the principles of math, which is obligation, guardianship, practice, and heritage, are the ones that enable this environmental philosophy to triumph. But for that to happen, if you take a look at all of these pictures, and these are all pictures that come from Africa, the environmental degradation, the effects, and if you have some sense of concern, it will get to you. Because when you see this, you can see the challenge that is going on. You add to this more recently, what I will say, the galamsey activities that are engaged on by the Chinese in Africa that are polluting the rivers and the water bodies, and humans are drinking that and having health problems. It's sad. And because of that, you cannot but be interested in sustainability. As I pointed out, the good thing is, from a math philosophy standpoint, the idea of worthiness, if we stuck to it, which is Imue, worthiness before nature, it would really help us. But just like I talked about in decolonization, there are challenges here as well. But before we come to the challenges, it's good for us to think about our obligations to the future, because we are intricately linked with nature. That's where we draw our resources from. And we have a responsibility to be guardians of it so that others can get it tomorrow. Our children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren tomorrow would have something. There is a shared heritage, I will say, or at least Karinga would say. And as a result of that, we have to do something to restore the situation. And so what I am observing, and in fact, I have just started, or at least I'm hoping to start, at a personal level, because of environmental pollution that is going on in what I would say my own village as a result of mining, that the health of the people is changing. The farming activities that used to go on to sustain the community has been transformed. That is no longer the case. And as a result, well-being is a problem. The dam, the only dam that supplied water to the people, somehow is polluted as a result of the mining. And yet there are no filtration systems that would help the people have clean water. So what are the challenges of sustainability in Africa? One, is institutional. And here I'm going to give an example from my country. As I mentioned earlier on, the Chinese, and in Ghana, for example, there is a lady who is known as Galamsey Queen. This Galamsey Queen essentially pays people to do Galamsey, and Galamsey is unregistered miners who are digging the ground, surface mining, and as a result, to get the gold or the diamond or the minerals, they're essentially polluting the rivers. And he's doing this all across almost all of Ghana. And some time ago, he was arrested and deported. He goes to China, changes his name, gets a different passport, and returns to Ghana and continues. They arrest him again, they arrest her again, takes her to China, she changes passport and name and returns. And come to find out, all this was going on with the aid of what you would call some politicians. And that makes it difficult because the villages that think that they have a solution are undermined by politicians. Another constraint is the reality that some of the people find their livelihood through the surface mining, the Galamsey, because there are no jobs. because their welfare is at stake. And if the government cannot do anything to help, then they have to find a way of living. And so there are some headwinds, and I just saw the notice that I have a few more minutes, so I'm going to be wrapping up here. But there are some headwinds when it comes to decolonization and sustainability that don't make it easy. But I know there are a lot of intelligent people who can come to try to get some solution for us, if possible, and that would help us. So given the time, let me again conclude by reiterating what I began, being grateful, acknowledging that Africa is linked to Brazil, and our common destiny is through the West or the Europeans and what they did during colonialism, such that the issues that we have today, some of them can be found in Brazil as well. And on that note, I would say thank you very much. And I would hand it over to Palestrante Sarah Pereira. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zoga. It was such a thoughtful presentation, wonderful words and insightful ideas that can lead us to discuss more further issues such as sustainability and decolonization. So now I'm gonna over to you, Sergio, Professor Sergio. So you can present your ideas and then we can discuss.
Thank you, Jussara. First, I have to thank Alqueta and Ampari for the invitation to be in this panel. It was really a great pleasure to listen to Professor Zoga. I really learned a lot from his presentation, and I hope we find more in common between Brazil and Africa, much beyond the European legacy, which was much before that and probably has to do with the math that I just learned from you here. So I'll share my screen here so that we go through what I am suggesting to show to you today. So basically, I will be on the decoloniality side of the equation of the panel today, which is where my research is based on it epistemologically. And what I'm gonna share with you is fruit of my practice as a professor, as researcher, and in the works you can find published with PhD students now that are now PhD professors, Vanessa Faria Silva, who I see is around, Anna Bauer, and lately with also colleagues, scholars from FGV, AISP, Amon Barros and Rafael Alcadipari. So my reflection with you today is going to be about how to decolonize our own research praxis. So first I will call upon, like say, entities, Osvaldo de Andrade through his Anthropophagic Manifesto. On his 51 aphorisms, I bring to light 3 of them so we never forget it when we're doing our research, our teaching, our education practices. We have to go against all catechesis, like Professor Zoga just said. His idea is on decoloniality is to move Africans away from Western thought. So the idea that we were never catechized is one of the few aphorisms that Oswald Andrade repeats along the manifest. And we have to be against the cadaverized ideas. So, and also I call upon Guerreiro Ramos. This is the very page 83 of the original book from 1958, which I have always with me here in my home office. So edited by Instituto Superior de Estudos Brasileiros. So law number 9, never forget it, law number 9 of sociological reduction. In the light of sociological reduction, all foreign knowledge is in principle subsidiary. Of course, as you see in the page, he's referring to Husserl, for instance, among many other European authors he cites. So not that we don't have to go there, but it has to be as a subsidiary to our own local knowledge. So as a subsidiary then, I embrace here the decolonial canon to turn the geography of reasoning. So this map is a map which is in the very first book edited by the project Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality by Latin American scholars, among them Mignolo, Argentinian philosopher Walter Mignolo. So having done that, let's agree with the decolonial project that theories may be built also from praxis, but really understood as thought, reflection, action, thought, reflection on this action. So the idea, again, paraphrasing Professor Zogan, is to delink from Western knowledge of modern concept of theory versus praxis. So in order to do this, I suggest today that we draw upon Brazilian thinkers, Paulo Freire and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. Of course, as you know, Paulo Freire has celebrated last year his 100th birthday, 2 days ago, 101st birthday. And his masterpiece, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is the third most cited book in social science. And Viveiros de Castro is one of the most known living Brazilian social scientists in Europe. Mainly, he's very well known among anthropologists. He considers himself a Brazilian Amerindian ethnographer. So then again, on the decolonial canal, this idea of building theories with those who have lived the colonial difference. So where they have resisted, existed, and helped people in their daily struggles. Paulo Freire, as you know, were the wretched of the earth, like Frantz Fanon named them. And Frantz Fanon, by the way, is one very present reference in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Viveiros de Castro with the Awarete, Amerindian tribe in Western Amazon. That's where he, in the mid-80s, has developed his thesis, his PhD thesis. He is now a professor at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I just came out of this meeting, online meeting, of course. And I put these words there, which I heard just 2 hours ago by Nita Freire, Ana Freire's widow. So just to show what she considers are really the main legacies of Paulo Freire. So the idea of cotidianeidade, everydayness, if we could translate like this. So that's from where he built his theory method, which are inseparable. So digging into the common sense of those people, and from there to theorize and help them transform themselves. So, of course, disclosure here. So we don't want to become proud decolonial thinkers, nor do we want to dispute who is more decolonial. This is no illumination on enlightenment, nor do we want to claim purism on the thoughts of both Freire and Viveiros. As we see, they draw upon very important European thinkers, mainly Viveiros de Castro on anthropologists like Lévi-Strauss, Deleuze, and Guattari. So no purism, but they should come beforehand. And the risk that we just praise purism is that, again, we sound parochial or proud decolonial thinkers. And to remind you that most of the scholars and the decolonial project are Hispanic from origin. So as we are not Indians, and as we are not Viveiros and Freire, all we can do is walk and question with them. In the words of Freire, keep walking and questioning. That's one of Freire's mantras. This is the book by Viveiros de Castro, which is a book that I have to read with a Portuguese dictionary nearby me. It's a book about the book he would not write. And in this book, he develops his Amerindian perspectivism. He learned it from the Awarete Amerindians. So this idea of penser autrement, thinking otherwise, thinking another mind, thinking with other minds. Not that we are imposing anything on the subject we want to investigate. So the concepts we could use to decolonize our research, pedagogical practices from Viveiros de Castro, reflexive displacement and controlled equivocation, which are among the Amerindian perspectivism, the Indian theory, like Viveiros calls them, and from the few things I just learned on math from Professor Zogan, I would say that Amerindian perspectivism has much in common with math, which of course may have happened much before we have encountered the Europeans. And from Freire, two concepts, bank and education, and its opposite, dialogical pedagogy. So then the question here is how we engage in research through the body of the other. And the first two concepts by Viveiros de Castro, from what he learned with the Awarete Amerindians, would pose first this question: if we want to practice reflexivity to decolonize our research practice. We sit in our laboratories, we build skyscraper theories and methodologies, and then we go to the field with our categories, concepts to measure the world. Do we ever question ourselves whether it makes any sense through the body of our subject, ex-object? So, according to Viveiros de Castro, these two concepts mean that we must make a reflexive displacement to the position of our subject. And when we do this, there is no other way we replace the very position of the subject. There will be a maximum we can do is to control the equivocation that will always be there, because to translate is to assume there has always been a mistake. So instead of imposing our categories and silencing the other, which is of course an ultimate redundancy, we have to realize that there is always a difference between what we and what they are saying. So this is how these two concepts may help us decolonize our practices. And from Freire, the bank and education built in the late 60s is what we would do in the traditional teaching by placing in the empty minds of students our knowledge. And the control of it is dialogical pedagogy. So building together with the knowledge from, like Nita just said, from their very common sense to build knowledge back to our science. Because like Nita just said, his method is rooted in everydayness. And it's inseparable from theory and method, which of course blows away Western criticization on theory coming first. So that may help us be reflexive in trying to decolonize our research practices. So trying to move to the end here then is really reflexivity, not only from our own perspective, but from the point of view of those we want to investigate. And what we deliver back to them on their emancipation, for instance, on their liberation. And we must be aware of the consequences of making this square meter that we go around and try to place our theoretical methodological on whatever we find in our research way. So to close with some words from Viveiros de Castro. So it's time for us to counter-analyze anthropologies that are all too familiar. In our case, anthropologies here mean the theories, methods, that we are much too familiar, that we import critically from the West, from the North, from the center, as you want to name it, from the global North. So it's the other way around. It's the time for us to read philosophers in the light of wild thought. It's because now it's the native's turn, the turn of the native. And when we do this, we may find other authors, theories, concepts, like we just learned at Srod, if I pronounce it correctly, continuity of people and nature, which is similar concept to the Norwegian perspective is that, and we can possibly have a better understanding of our own realities. So that were my initial ideas. Shusara, I give back to you.
Thank you, Professor Sergio. It was again a bright presentation, brilliant thoughts about how we could develop this thinking in a sense that we can also have our theories from Brazil and from Latin America to think about how we can develop a better world and how we can change this patterns of management and its relation to nature. So now I'm gonna present my thoughts also, and then we can discuss all us together. And if anyone from the audience would like to join us, it's also invited. So I'm gonna present now my thoughts, but I don't have a such nice presentation as Professor Sérgio and Professor Zoga had. I have just my word here, and I'll read to you. So it's urgent to understand the influence of anthropocentrism and coloniality in the human conception of nature, and also its benefits and effects in the field of management. Because modernity came as a colonized discourse to say to us that they had a promise to make things better, to organize our society, and develop our world. But in fact, they put in us ideas such as race and such as exploitation that is now counting for us in our society. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to now, there is a significant increase in the rates of human activity that may illustrate how the past 17 years have been a period of unprecedented change in human history. This entire context draws our attention to responsible boundary planets in the Anthropocene period that led us to this part now that we have climate change, natural disasters, technological disasters that are accounting for vulnerable populations. As Professor Zogan said, and also Professor Sergio said, we need other approaches, different approaches that differs from the classic utilitarianism and models of practice in management. To promote this conservation of biodiversity and sustainable thought in management, we should put our organizations to think about how our practice is still colonized by Europe and even North America. In this sense, it is important to question how administration and our interest in management for sustainability and nature or biodiversity lead us to a thought that is not so sustainable. It is more a discourse that is here to convince us that we are doing that, but in fact, we are not doing that. How could we disassociate this anthropocentric view in our society and our management literature to the point that we can really live sustainability or things like that? in fact, it is important to think about that because when modernity came in Brazil, for example, we have other people that already had their contact with nature and animals and fauna, and they were living in that sense with a amazing relationship with all these all these um, all these patterns, right? But what bothers me about sustainability is the fact that the same people that said that modernity means to appropriate nature and conquers other species and races are the same ones that is now saying that we need to care about our world. And business should care about biodiversity. In fact, that native people from Latin America or other continents already had this kind of preoccupation at that time. But at that time, this preoccupation with nature and biodiversity wouldn't mean sustainability. In fact, it would mean a lack of modernity. And today we have this model of sustainability that it is interesting to business because the white people from Europe said that sustainability matters. And in that sense, it was so important to hear Professor Zogam because he introduced it to us, I think, and I thought that I never heard about. So it is important to think about that, to think how our population can live this kind of sustainability that we are talking in companies. So if these modern things that focused on civilized society has produced a kind of humanity that lost this contact with nature, that separated human beings from nature. He is what Krenak said. Krenak is indigenous from Brazil. He is also he's read a book called I'm talking English, so now I forgot the name of the book in Portuguese. But how we could adiar o fim do mundo. So he brings to us this conceptualization that said to us that we need to have a new form of thinking that can put together human and nature in a form that we can live together, and there is a well-being for both, even for humans, even for natures and other species. So we need to understand the influence of coloniality in the human conception of nature, because the effects of colonialization still persists in our management thinking, especially when we are talking about sustainability, corporate social responsibility. Companies are doing their sustainability reports saying that they are so responsible, but in fact they are not so responsible because they keep harm our society in a way that the vulnerable population is the most population that are suffering now. We are talking about sustainability and all issues regarding climate change. But climate change won't affect us equally because the distribution of the risk among social groups is unfair. What I mean by this, environmental risk is not equally distributed. So populations minorized by characteristics of income, education, color, and gender, they will suffer more. And we are even talking about that and how climate change will cause disasters that won't affect us equally, especially when we are considering vulnerable populations. They are exposed for more to social risks. So we needed to put these discussions in the management field so we can see a way that this kind of groups can discuss with us how all this change will affect them and their life. I would like to say that disasters, they are not limited for external factors that affect our society. It's also, we also need to consider the way in which the economic development model is constructed in each region that it will be affected by climate change. And we needed to put this kind of discussions in the table in management field because we will need this for the next few years since we are talking more about anthropocentrism and how organizations are causing harm to our society and to our communities. In the sense, disasters is not just a problem of development, but it is intensified by the development of each religion. One thing that I would like to address more is that poverty and disasters are intrinsic variable. So in this sense, we need to discuss this kind of sustainability that are being driven by European society, because they have a kind of development that it's very different from our society, and the variables that we have here in Brazil, and the kind of population that we have in Brazil, the kind of characteristics of our population, such as income, education, color, and gender. So we needed to discuss this so these groups would resist more in their territories. So I'm gonna finish now my thoughts, and now I think we can discuss together all the presentations that we had here. And if someone would like to join us giving questions about Professor Zoga presentations or Professor Sergio presentations, will be such a nice discussion to be here. Thank you. Oh, Tel post here, Ideias to Postpone the End of the World. It was the book that I was trying to think, but I was thinking Portuguese and English, so I got confused. So those Does anyone have questions for Professor Sergio or Professor Zoga?
Jussara,
Hi, Sergio.
I'd like to develop with Professor Zoga on the possible common base of what he introduced, Matt and Amerindian perspectivism. I think this could be an interesting way of looking for common roots in the thoughts of our original people, because Viveiro de Castro in the book says that this cosmovision of our Wareté tribe in Western Amazon was common to other Amerindian tribes in North America. So, and one thing I did not mention when you said this unicity of people and nature under Matt. So Amerindian perspectivism also has this idea of a unicity of soul, and souls meaning living people, living animals, and dead people and dead animals, and singularity of bodies. And the perspective is how the position is activated from the body with a soul. So just to illustrate, he starts the book with an anecdote made by Lévi-Strauss when the Spaniards reached Americas. They had these big philosophical inquiries whether the Amerindians would have a soul. But on the other side, from the perspective of the Amerindians, their doubt was that if that white pale thing was a body. So Lévi-Strauss says that what the Amerindians did was that they were drowning the dead soldiers, dead Spanish soldiers, to see if the body would rot like their own. So they then could realize that that was actually a body. But they were sure they had a soul. There was no doubt about it because animals had a soul. But again, from the perspective of the Spaniards, Amerindians were animals without soul. So the conclusion of Lévi-Strauss is that the Amerindians were in fact more generous because they thought that what they did not know, these white bodies, were gods, right? There was this myth that the gods, there was a legend that said that white gods would come from the ocean. So again, just some concepts and ideas behind Amerindian perspectivism that may help us build a dialogue with Matt. And of course, I know nothing about Matt, just what you just enlightened us today about. Could you say something about this on unicity of souls and body? If there's anything on Matt also around this?
Right. Yeah, I can share a little bit. And in fact, I'm trying to think of the recent paper where I was arguing. Yes, in the recent paper, I was arguing about the concept of time from an African perspective and how it is common in the among the Amerindians and other societies across the world. But with regard to math, math, because of the central role of God or religion in the lives of the people, the divine was, it kind of oriented how they viewed other people. And so as the argument they made was that a human being here on earth is just essentially on, if you want to call it, a caretaker role, because eventually the person is going to go up to God or would go up to the next world. And in that next world, the person is going to live also with God, so to speak. And how they treat one another on earth is going to impact how they are able to live together in the next world. So this idea of soul and linkage to the next world through what they call spirituality or the divine was so central in most of the books that center around math, like the books of the dead, or what some people call the wisdom books. And essentially, they all ensure or they all talk about why it is important to consider human beings as worthy, but also to consider the things that make human beings live in a meaningful way as equally worthy. So if you are getting your source of livelihood from nature, you have to consider nature as worthy and valuable and treat it in a way that would enable or sustain you as you live on earth until you leave and go to the next world. Okay. So that is why, according to Karenga, the divine, the people, and nature matter. But Obenga extended that a little bit to talk about the various domains of humans and how that matters, to say that, look, in addition to all these other three, we have to add the person into it. And in fact, that is a good point that you made, because it'll be good to see some of how, let me say, African ancient philosophy as espoused by Matt link up to other philosophies in other places like the Amerindians or in the other places. I think that would be interesting to kind of bring that up, particularly when it comes to how you treat people and nature or the environment.
Wow, wonderful
Thank you very
comment.
much, Professor Zoga.
Thank you very much, Professor Sergio and Professor Zoga. Now we have a question for the audience, from the audience. Ana Carol, would you like you to join us and open your micro? Okay, thank you. Okay, we can't hear you. Maybe I can do that. Just a minute, Ana. Yeah.
Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah.
Thank you all for the inspirational speech. I'm here thinking a lot of things, and I'd like to share some thoughts that I'm having now. So it's like, it's a big question, but I will try to summarize it. What could be the impact of the anthropocentric view and the colonialism in our identity as a human, in the definition, in the conception that we as human make of our humanity, and basically in the answer that we give to a basilar question, a philosophical question, who we are. So if you turn the ontological position, I think you can turn the the answer for this kind of question, and it has a huge impact in our practices in administration field, for example. Thank you, Jussara.
You're welcome. Wow. Who would like to start answering that question?
Is it Anna's question or the questions on the chat?
It is Anna questions.
Okay.
And then we can move for the questions in the chat.
Okay. Okay. The idea that Anna talked about, I have, in reflecting on the situation in Africa, vis-a-vis colonialism, came up with what I call identity capture. And the colonialists or the Europeans engage, if you look at it from social symbolic work perspective, engage in practices that essentially were intended to capture the identity of Africans. And that identity capture did not end even with colonialism. It still continues to this day. One example, which I call the sustenance or maintenance practices, include among the Anglophone, the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is an organization that is meant to link all the former colonies of Britain. Essentially underneath it, or couched in it, is a sense that, oh, the way we were as the masters, now we have this body that we could tell you how things should be done and how things should be done in this body of countries. The Commonwealth is not limited to only the Anglophone. You have the Francophone having similar organizations, the Lusophone having similar organizations, and even the Germans having similar organizations. They are all identity capture maintenance mechanisms. That is why I said decolonization is going to be challenging. Because to get rid of it, I mean, to actually have meaningful decolonization, these structures that maintain the colonial linkages have to be severed, but they would not be, or they have not been yet. Let me put it that way. Maybe Sergio would have something to add.
Sergio, do you have something to add to Anna's question?
Yes, I think Professor Zogan has covered. So maybe I could pick up on Tel's comments on the chat to move on.
Sure, sure. There is actually two, right? Silvio and Tel. You can answer Tel's questions, Professor Tel questions, and then we can go to Silvio questions. Thank you.
Tel, thank you very much for your question. So the idea is methodologies that we could combine with the colonial epistemology, let's call it this way. So I mentioned at the beginning that my presentation was based on discussions with PhD students that now have graduated. One of them is here, Vanessa Faria Silva. On her thesis, she has made use of participatory action research as a methodology that could go along with decolonial epistemology. Her paper has just been published at Cadernos EBAPE. We are together there. So, and then again, we may have this idea, as you know, participatory action research also has some influence from Paulo Freire, but it was developed in the 1960s in Latin America. So again, an original methodology from Latin America. She has based her PAR on Bosco Pinto. So Professor Tiola was our inspiration on following this track. And then it's also a methodology that can help us as researchers to give back something to the communities, to the subjects we are studying, which is one of the aims of the colonial project. So this was what she developed in her thesis, and on my thesis more on critical organizational history. Of course, we make use of methodologies that are sweet, let's say so, not so imposing on the subjects we want to investigate. And then reflexivity is along all phases of the research is one key methodological element we follow. Again, back to Guerreiro Ramos. He says sociological reduction is a methodological attitude, right? So I hope I could give you some clues, and just came out in the last number of Cadernos EBAP, the paper by Silva and Vanderlei on decolonial and participatory action research as potential methodologies for organizational studies. I hope I have replied your answer to.
Okay, I'm seeing Tel snoozing. Do you want to talk something, Tel? Should I unmute you or not? Okay.
No, thanks. I'll be listening. Very good discussion here. Thanks a lot for sharing all this knowledge. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tel. Professor Zogan, do you want to add something to Professor Tel's questions?
Yeah, I wanted to add that for the methodologies to work, from my perspective, you need what I will call conditions. There have to be conditions that facilitate meaningful learning for the methodologies to be fruitful or effective. And if those conditions are not there, it's likely the methodologies will run into problems. And by that I mean, if you take, for instance, in Africa or in Ghana, to be more specific, if you do not have, let's say, leadership saying from now onwards, the way things are taught, let's say, and I'm going to use, for instance, in Rwanda. In Rwanda, after the conflict, the leader simply said, from now onwards, no French. Everything has to be taught in English. So if you wanted to teach French, whatever methodologies that were associated with France or with French, you couldn't use them. But there was support and structures for methodologies in English. And that's just one example, but you need the conditions there for the methodologies to be effective. And that's all that I wanted to add on that point.
Thank you. I think Sergio and Professor Zoga already addressed a lot of the issues. Tel, I would like to add that social devolutions can be really fair to not be a extractivist researcher when you are in the field. And when I was doing my PhD research, I saw a lot of researchers going in the field asking, "Hi, are you unaffected by the mood?" Like in this kind of way and this kind of approach. And but if you are with the community and you are giving social devolutions, they will see you as a person that are contributing to the cause. So in this sense, I think I would like to add these, the social devolution thinking in our research, because it's so important to think about that, right? So I think we can, if you have something to tell, you can share with us. But if you don't have, we can move forward to the next question. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Great point that you put to us, Jusara, thanks a lot. I think in the same way, it's quite important, the social devolution. In our research program, in our research team, we are working with the social validation of the research before you start collecting data inside the community. The community told to us, this research is important to us. And let's do this together in an engaged way. So you have knowledge that belongs to the community. And you can use as academic knowledge too. Thanks a lot. Very good discussion here. Thanks.
Thank you. So should we go now for the third question? I think is Professor Silvio.
Yes, Silvio Stefani.
Yes. Would you like to answer that, Sergio? How do you see?
I may start, as I just opened my mic. So ESG, environment, social, and governance. Well, what I'm afraid of is that it may just be replacing CSR or CSR, right? Jusara, how you name it? Irresponsible.
Yeah, CSIR, corporate social irresponsibility.
So I hear it, and my first reaction is, okay, let's see where it goes. So we have to be aware of what we have already learned from greenwashing. And now I see the concept of rainbow washing coming out for what covers this diversity, inclusion in companies. So let's say if it is a genuine initiative from people inside organizations, let's have a look at it. But like law number 9 of sociological reduction, as subsidiary, but still becoming suspicious where it goes. I'm afraid it may just replace irresponsible CSR.
Yes, such a good comment. Go ahead, Professor.
I agree with Sergio perfectly. In fact, I don't think replacing sustainability with ESR is a good thing. I think you need something better and stronger. And some people are even beginning to make the case, and that is Laszlo and Cooper Ryder and others are making the case that we should move from sustainability to flourishing. Because when you do that, essentially it's a higher level than the sustainability. And I tend to be on that camp rather than sustainability to ESG. I think that is just a way for people to use the ESG database. So in one sense, it's almost like selling their product and so on and so forth. But I personally would be okay with moving from sustainability to flourishing rather than sustainability to ESG. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that we can learn from ESG is the governance letter, I think, because yes, I completely agree with Professor Sergio and Professor Zolger, because we are afraid that these 3 letters are just same as sustainability, CSR, CSIR. But the letter governance, it's really important, especially when we are talking about disasters. Because what I thought in my research is because the community are not being invited to say how they really want to be compensate. And the governance, it's good in that sense, right? If you are being affected by something and the company has governance, they should, in fact, clearly ask you, how do you want to be compensated? But companies are not there yet. So I'm also afraid that these three letters with good intentions just say same as business as usual, you know? So we need to be careful about these letters, but we also need to learn something from them. And I think we can take the governance part as good for sure. We have more questions here. So let's see if
there were additional comments by Tel on Guerreiro Ramos. Just to remind all of us that he is black, and he was black. And to add, according to Vanessa's research, his relatives, he was born at the beginning of the 20th century, so just basically 20 years after the abolition of slavery in Brazil. So her research pointed out that it's not fully confirmed by his genealogical tree, but apparently his father or grandfather, well, one of them was a slave himself. So yes, you did mention Teatro Experimental do Negro with Abdias Nascimento, late 40s, 50s, and Abdias Nascimento was a student with Guerreiro in ISEB. That was in my PhD thesis, I found out Abdias Nascimento name in the list of his students at ISEB, which was a big surprise to me. So that means they were working together also in science, let's say so. So it's really important to recover. And just a special issue on Guerreiro Ramos has been launched, organized by Professor Ariston Azevedo and other people, and he has even recovered some of the writings of Guerreiro Ramos that were not identified before. And I was very grateful that in the PhD research made by Anna Bauer, we found letters handwritten by Guerreiro Ramos from the 60s. And he was apologizing to Ford Foundation because he was delayed in finalizing the book he was paid for by Ford Foundation, the 1996 development. I have the book here in my personal shelf at home there. And so if even when I read that letter, I said, if even Guerreiro Ramos was apologizing for not meeting the deadline, we can do that, right?
Yeah.
And then another letter from director of EBAPE, Beatriz Valles, to University of California, so where he later became a professor. She was making a recommendation letter for Guerreiro Ramos. So Guerreiro Ramos needed a recommendation letter until in the mid-60s. So just to say that he was a human being like ourselves, but one very rich knowledge, one that we do have to bring forward whenever we need it. I have sociological reduction here always with me on the regional edition, and law number 9 of sociological reduction always strikes my mind when I try to build on shelf knowledge from the north to facilitate our entry in the house of knowledge from Western community. So I keep it always in my mind.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, all of you that have been here with us. We have just 1 minute to close our session, so I'm gonna be quickly here. But if you wanted to continue the discussion, we have a chat or a room here in the link. So I'm gonna invite you if you wanted to stay with us in this conversation. And thank you again, Professor Sergio Vanderlei and Professor Zoga. It was such a nice afternoon be here with you.